Hi folks! We're going to continue on learning about sociological research in this lecture, and we're going to do so by analyzing some additional articles that I've found out on the web. Now remember, all of the information that you're learning in this lecture series relates to Chapter 2, which is Research Methods and Designs, and that's going to be one of the more technical chapters, and we're going to save it for the end of the semester. But by then, if you're grasping what you're learning in these particular modules and lessons, you're going to be good to go. All right, now, again, we're going to be looking for quite a few things here, and some of these we've already learned. We've learned population frames, we've discussed generalizability and research questions, we've talked a little bit about variables. We will do more in this lecture. We also have talked about the ethics of research, the peer review process, and we've also talked about reliability and validity. In this particular lecture, we're going to talk about how to find a hypothesis in what you're reading. We're going to talk about variables and variable relationships, meaning the relationship between independent and dependent variables. And then we're also going to talk about how to find the research findings or the conclusions that researchers came to. Okay, so for a first step in this particular lesson, I'm going to ask you to pause the recording and read the article linked to the lesson titled A Blogger's Text Messages. So do that now. All right, so what we're going to concentrate on now is finding the hypothesis, and that's not always going to be an obvious thing to pick out from what you're reading, and it's not always going to be an easy thing to find. But I'm going to give you a little tool that will help you to be able to isolate what the hypothesis might be. Now, before we do that, we have to make sure we understand what a hypothesis is. A hypothesis is a tentative statement about the relationship between variables, your independent and your dependent variable. And it's really important to craft a strong hypothesis because in research, your hypothesis is your starting point for measurement, and it allows you to gather data and analyze data that is meaningful. Now remember, we're talking about the scientific process or the scientific method here, and when you craft that hypothesis, it gives you the ability to measure your variables. Now I know you're all familiar with the scientific process, and the hypothesis comes really at the beginning of the data collection process. You know, you've already decided the topic that you want to study, and you've already done your research. You've already looked back to find out what other people have already investigated about that particular topic. So what you hope is that you can find a hypothesis or create a hypothesis that is original, that is new, that is interesting and meaningful to society. Now here's my trick for you. The easiest way to figure out what a hypothesis is to try and figure it out in terms of an if-then statement. A hypothesis is always an if-then statement, meaning that if this happens, then that happens, or if this is present, then this result happens. This and that are your variables, your independent and your dependent variable. So it doesn't matter what kind of scientific research we're doing, a hypothesis is always expressed as an if-then statement. Remember that for all of your science classes. If you can figure out the if this, then that statement, then you're going to be able to isolate your variables. Now remember this, a dependent variable requires action from the independent variable. And the way that I always remembered this when I first started trying to memorize the point of or the purpose of dependent and independent variables, I would always say to myself, the dependent variable depends on action from the independent variable. So if you translate that to your if-then statement, your independent variable is the if side of the equation, and your dependent variable is the then side of the equation. In other words, if this is present, then this will happen. So the dependent variable is requiring action from the independent variable. So now at this point, you should be able to go back to your article about the blogger's text messages and figure out what her independent and dependent variables are. You should be able to figure out her hypothesis. And if you want to pause the lecture now to see if you can find those, feel free to do so. All right, so now let's pause again and read the article, The One Thing Americans Fear the Most. Again, reading for comprehension, making sure you understand in a general way what's happening. So pause the recording now and come back when you're ready. All right, were you able to locate the hypothesis? And how about the variables, the independent and dependent variable? Remember, always the dependent variable requires action from the independent variable. So if this, then that. And here's an example for you. If independent, then dependent is, for example, if study time, then higher grade. And it doesn't really make a whole lot of sense if I switch those around. If higher grade, then study time. Of course, I suppose that there may be some people, if they got a really good grade, it would make them study more. But it makes more sense, and it's more reasonable to assume that if you study hard, your grade will increase. So for the articles you've already read, you should be able to create an if-then statement, which tells you your hypothesis, which allows you to identify your independent and dependent variables. And if you've not done that yet for these two articles, please go back and do so now. We're going to move on to our final piece of this particular lesson, and we're going to learn how to interpret research findings. Now, if you can figure out what a research hypothesis is, this will help you to isolate the findings or the results of that particular research. So what I'm going to ask you to do is to find the article Researchers Have Figured Out What Makes Us Happy, and pause the recording now and read that article. All right, so were you able to figure out the if-then statement? Were you able to figure out the hypothesis? And have you identified the independent and dependent variables? If you did that, that's fantastic. But now, one step further, what were the findings? What conclusion did these researchers come to? Now remember, if you can pick out that hypothesis and the variables, this will help you to figure out what the conclusion of the researchers is. Okay, from this point forward, I'm not giving you the answers to the questions anymore. I'm going to ask you that you fill in what you can on your article analysis worksheet, always remembering to return to the previous articles and fill in whatever gaps you can. So at this point, we've covered about 6 articles, I think. So you should make sure that you go back and fill in all of the information that you can for each of those articles. There may be some articles where you can't fill in all of the information. You simply don't have enough information to do so. At the end of the semester, you're going to be turning that article analysis worksheet in. You will get credit for what I'm going to call a good college try. I remember when I was first learning how to identify all of these different components, it was very, very challenging for me. So I'm not expecting that you are perfect, and I'm not expecting that you get every answer right, but I am expecting that you give it a good try. All right, by now, here's what you should be able to determine: population frames, research questions, generalizability of the findings, reliability and validity, ethical standards, whether or not they've been met or the threshold has been met, the hypothesis, your variables, and your research findings. If you're struggling, reach out on the general questions discussion board, or go back and review, or email me. All right, until next time, take care. Bye-bye.